Okay, great. Yeah, okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. This is the second seminar in Ukrainian Studies of Fall of 2019 and the first seminar affiliated with our new Temirtay Contemporary Ukraine program. My name is Emily Channel Justice. I'm the director of the program. As you can see on our schedule, we are hosting a few of the seminars throughout the fall and spring as well. This is our first one. We're going to try to draw in contemporary researchers, contemporary topics. So we're very excited to have a very timely lecture about energy security. I have a little more information about our new TCUP program here if you're interested. I'm more than happy to talk to anybody about it if you have questions, or also if you have topics that you're interested in for seminars, speakers you'd like to bring. I'm open to all of your suggestions. So basically, the organization of this event is a little bit more slightly informal, more of a Q&A. I'm going to be presenting some questions kind of about the nature of Nord Stream 2 and energy security. It might be a little bit along the lines of main kind of narratives. What do we know? What don't we know? What can we expect in the future? So I'm going to ask questions. Ben's going to answer them, and then we'll open it up to your questions as well. So we're very excited to hear more about Nord Stream. So Benjamin Schmidt is our postdoctoral research fellow at the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics and the former European Energy Security Advisor at the U.S. Department of State. I'm going to let him tell us a little bit more about the way that astrophysics and energy policy come together, and then we'll start off our question and answer.
Great. Thanks so much, Emily. It's really a pleasure to be here, and it's great to be, I guess, the inaugural speaker of the new Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute TCUP program. So thanks, everyone, for coming. My name is Benjamin Schmidt. As Emily said, I'm currently a postdoctoral research fellow at the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics, where I'm working with a team of experimental physicists to design, develop, test, and ultimately deploy a new set of millimeter wavelength telescope facilities to the South Pole, which we'll be doing later this year, heading down to the Amundsen Scott South Pole Station. First wave of folks going in November, and then I'll be going in the second half of the season, the summer season, austral summer season, in end of December, early January. We're looking at the cosmic microwave background. There is a very tenuous connection to energy in the sense that we're looking at some of the fundamental properties of the universe that contribute to our understanding of things like dark matter and dark energy. But that's really for another time. So please put away your general relativity textbooks if you have them here. We're not going to be talking about that today, but excited to be doing that. So maybe more directly related to what's going on in this lecture today, I was, for the past 4 years, the European Energy Security Advisor at the Bureau of Energy Resources of the U.S. Department of State. And maybe you're thinking, how did I get into that if I've been building telescopes? Before going to the State Department, spent my doctoral research time developing instrumentation for new telescopes that we built, also looking at the cosmic microwave background in northern Chile at high altitude on an extinct volcano. So in between those two telescopes, I worked for 4 years at the State Department. There is a program that's run by the IEEE organization, an Institute for Electronics and Electrical Engineering, if they still go by that exact term, to bring scientists into the State Department, into the government specifically, to work on national security sort of issues. And so I entered and had a selection of offices I could work at, and I thought energy at least has some level of technical basis. I was maybe underestimating how important the science and technology that's underlying energy is to the sort of policy making that we had. So I came into the department in the middle of the summer of 2015, and my office director at the time decided that he was going to assign me just a small, somewhat quiet portfolio. There's some projects going on to kind of get up to speed on some of the geopolitics that's going on in the region, but to give me the Nordic-Baltic portfolio and not really much else. at the start, just to kind of because I was new to diplomacy. 2 weeks after I started, at the end of August 2015, early September 2015, Nord Stream 2 was announced. And that took me from a 1-year fellowship until basically extending all the way through April of this year. So that's where I've come from. This has obviously been a fundamental and transformational issue in terms of a test maybe for European energy security and energy geopolitics, and the approach that the transatlantic community has taken with respect to the energy practices of the Russian Federation, and also how to secure our own energy supplies. So maybe sticking with the science and technology themes, it's really no surprise that the large-scale political integration that Europe has experienced from basically the end of World War II until now has at its basis a fundamental technology or energy connection. Remember that the first predecessor of the eventual European Union was the European coal and steel community, right? So that's basically the underlying structures that basically taking practical technical cooperation and extending that from the late 40s, early 50s, all the way through 2015 with the establishment of the European Energy Union, and all of the sort of major issues that are going on in energy security today. So that's really how energy security is unique in foreign policy and national security policy, because it's one of the few areas that you really can make basically transformational or really cross-cutting policy decisions based on practical technical technologies and science underlying what is driving that policy. So that's really what drives and what's motivated the United States to focus on energy security in Europe for decades. This is not some new phenomenon. This is something that we at least back to the mid 80s and the fall of the wall, and supporting European energy diversification, starting with the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan oil pipeline in the early 90s through all of the projects of common interest today. So that's the sort of framework that I'd like to build off of going into this, and really just have that discussion of what is energy security, so we can kind of have a fundamental framework to build off of, and look at how it is so multidisciplinary across technical, legal, historiographic, and science and technology areas, and then ultimately where does this leave us with respect to the here and now, Nord Stream 2, and the confluence of a few major events, including the continued development of Nord Stream 2, the expiration of the current Naftogaz Gazprom gas contract at the end of this year, the potential for a major energy crisis on January 1st, 2020, and then ultimately the folks that are going to be doing this are all new in office, from President Zelensky's team in Kyiv to a brand new European Commission starting on November 1st. So that's kind of the framework that I'd like to go through today, and then have a nice discussion afterwards.
Great. So let's talk about kind of policy in general, definitions. How is the transatlantic community defining energy security? What has been the U.S. attitude toward Ukrainian energy security in the past, European energy security? Are there continuities in energy policies from the past and to now? And what are the kind of main national security objectives regarding energy?
Sure, yeah. So I think that it'd be great to kind of go through some of the definitional areas of how the transatlantic community approaches energy security, and then I'm basically doing this through the U.S. engagement framework. So it's going to have kind of a dual-moded approach of looking at how the U.S. has basically supported Europe's energy security for the past at least 3 decades, if not more. And I think that the first thing I want to say is that the energy security posture that the U.S. and Europe has taken has kind of broadened, especially in the past maybe 4 or 5 years, because of a number of trends, both geopolitical and technical. But at the foundation, the first of maybe the 5 pillars of energy security that I often talk about are developing that hardware and the software. The hardware being the energy diversification infrastructure, and the software being the regulatory regimes, market liberalization regimes, and policy frameworks that the EU has formed to move the energy and national security goals that underpin the European energy market forward. So in terms of hardware, we talk about three main areas of energy security: source countries, delivery routes, and fuel types. So you have diversity of all of these. You don't want to be dependent on just one country. You don't want to be dependent, even if you're getting it from kind of the same area, on one route, whether it be for hydrocarbons or electricity. And then domestically having a diversity of fuel types, whether it be imported or generated domestically, in terms of oil and gas, renewables, nuclear. And I always put this in here because I started my career working in laser fusion research at the University of Rochester. So eventually one day thermonuclear fusion as a clean energy source, but that is still down the road. It's often said that it's been 40 years away for the past 40 years, and it's 40 years away today. So hopefully we're doing a little bit better than that. But there's been a lot of progress in terms of, and I'm going to kind of start focusing more on the European gas market, because that's where a lot of the geopolitics come into play with respect to what's going on between Europe, especially NATO's eastern flank, Ukraine, and the Russian Federation over the past several decades. And there's been a lot of progress in making the European gas market complete. There is a lot of missing interconnectors. So this is the ENTSO-G. This is the European gas map that has a lot of the interconnectors that are either they're either in operation today or are planned. And although this looks like a very dense map and there's a lot of infrastructure there, there's a lot of gaps that are still being filled, and that includes basically building this north-south gas corridor between basically basically all the way far north is Finland and Estonia, down all the way to Greece. And in the past few years, there's been a program called the Three Seas Initiative that has brought these countries together and pushed forward the EU projects of common interest that are within that framework, and that includes advancement of progress on the Norway to Denmark to Poland Baltic Pipe project, will bring Norwegian gas to Central Europe directly for the first time in history. The Finland to Estonia Baltic Connector project, the gas interconnector Poland-Lithuania, the GIPO project. And then I've just learned, I was in DC earlier this week, that Romania is making more progress on getting infrastructure, the Brua pipeline that would bring domestically produced offshore Black Sea gas to Central Europe for the first time in history. And then also Greece is making progress on bringing Eastern Mediterranean gas either through a pipeline or through LNG up into the Western Balkans. So these are all really important. At the same time that the U.S. and European Union have cooperated to push forward a lot of these projects. We've also had a lot of collective concerns about projects that we believe would undermine Europe's own energy security, and that includes the proposed Nord Stream 2 and Turkish Stream projects that are at various levels of construction or completion today, which is what we'll talk about for the second half of this talk. But that's basically the gas map as it is in September 2019. In terms of the software supporting European energy market liberalization policies and regulatory structures, that really has come about a lot more in the past decade, and that's based on two things. Number one, the 2015 Energy Union project, which basically allowed for a framework to, in terms of the gas supply, diversify away from Russian dominance of the European gas market and build all of those interconnectors and projects of common interest that I just mentioned. It should be pointed out that there's something like 248 projects of common interest, and if everything's a project of common interest and a priority, then nothing's a priority. So a lot of these countries have tried to focus on a smaller subset of these projects to actually make some progress under this framework. So it's been fairly effective so far. And at the same time, you can have all of the interconnectors in the world, but if they're not operating under normal market rules, then you're going to have issues. And that's why in 2009, the EU passed the third energy package, and that allows for really the market liberalization that we would come to expect today, and has for all of these pieces of energy infrastructure the requirements, especially in the gas market, for ownership unbundling. That means you can't own the means of supply and transit and distribution. So breaking up that kind of vertical monopoly possibility. Third-party access, meaning that there's basically competition to book capacity and to use this critical infrastructure. Transparent retail markets and tariff rates, and the establishment of national regulators in each member state of the EU, and also an overarching agency for the cooperation of energy regulators called ACER, which is kind of an umbrella to bring all of those regulators together and create rules and regulations. There's been a number of things that have happened just this year that have strengthened, I would argue, the regulatory environment that Europe enjoys right now. Number one is the update to the EU gas directive to extend EU rules to pipelines to and from third countries. I'll talk about that in the Nord Stream context a little bit later. And then also just a few weeks ago, or a week and a half ago, the General Court of the European Court of Justice responded and ruled in favor of Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia in a claim that Gazprom can no longer use the Opal pipeline, that is the onshore portion of Nord Stream 1, at full capacity. Basically, it had a monopoly given a decision by the European Commission to allow it to do so and basically operate in an exemption from normal EU third-party access rules back in 2016. So those are things that have happened recently, and those are generally the kind of fundamental areas of energy security that the U.S. and the EU have worked on for a long time, and this sort of thing. But we do face new challenges, especially in the past few years, with a few other trends. So energy security has then been extended, and the discussion is really a lot broader than just the hardware and the software. It's also ensuring the resiliency of European energy and critical infrastructure to cyber and physical security vulnerabilities. You can have the most liberalized market that has the most infrastructure options and optionality possible, but if you're hit by a cyber or physical security attack, it's all over. These pieces of infrastructure then just become statues. They're not actually doing anything to help your security environment. So that's important to remember, and something that both the U.S. and European Union at the political level and also in terms of NATO military cooperation have focused on. The other area that there's been an increased focus on is advancing operational energy security objectives in the military security context, in terms of especially NATO's enhanced forward presence in the Baltic states. One of the things I like to point out is that during the Cold War, NATO and basically the U.S. and its NATO allies built a dedicated oil and refined products pipeline network specifically for potential military contingencies in Europe. And the thing that has happened in the 30 years since the fall of the wall is that this pipeline network has not really been extended. So it actually doesn't just stop at the former Warsaw Pact countries. It stops at the Fulda Gap in the center of Germany. So that's something that for interoperability and for enhanced security operation support of these fuel types needs to be extended to connect all the way through Tallinn. And the other thing is looking at what the enhanced forward presence is doing. It's deterring Russian aggression in the Baltic states in terms of its rotational troop presence. And so there are situations where a lot of the legacy infrastructure for jet fuel and refined products need to be looked at and make sure that there's not a overdependence on Russian supplied fuel types, either by ownership of refineries or from direct supplies from the Russian Federation, given that these operations are specifically aimed at deterring Russian aggression. And then finally, and big things in the news in the past few years, is countering Russian malign influence and disinformation campaigns. That has been kind of an overarching discussion. My phone, I will just say it again for the camera, my phone was broken today, and so I don't really know, has there been any news about these sort of things, or Ukraine, or anything going on? And I guess that obviously this is all really topical at this point. But on one hand, we've seen the growth of the use of Russian basically disinformation sources like Sputnik and RT to spread Kremlin tropes about basically anti-Western tropes in general, but also against transatlantic energy trade and themes regarding the U.S. and European position on projects like Nord Stream 2. The reason I'm showing these kind of crazier headlines on the left here is that during this period we've seen a rise in what I've called zombie websites, and these are websites that have been basically abandoned. They're old URLs that 10, 15 years ago you might have your WordPress page or a home page or something like that, and you forget about it and you think it's gone, and a decade later it's been picked up by someone that's basically aiming at using this as a disinformation conduit. Mice Times of Asia, for example, is a good example of this, and that is a situation where MICE in this case stands for meetings, investments, conferences, and exhibitions, and it was an actual website that did Asian business news. And that operated up until about 2014, and then they went out of business. The URL is still there, and all of a sudden in mid-2017, it popped up, and you can see it's been rebranded the Mice Times, as in the actual animal, the mouse, Times of Asia. And the interesting thing about this is you might say, okay, who cares? It's just one website. And what we found is when you type in keywords related to certain of these topical areas, in this case Nord Stream 2 or Turkish Stream or European energy security related terms, these websites will come up high in the Google search engine optimization. And that is because they're using something that has a significant history. Obviously, there's a big concern about Russian malign influence in terms of co-option and coercion and elite capture for current and former European leaders, and I'll get back to that in the Nord Stream story, but that is basically the approach that the US and Europe has looked at in terms of the sort of topics that are being discussed right now on European energy security and how we've approached this. Okay. So that's the 101 of what this is.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk a little bit more about Nord Stream 2 itself. It seems to me that there are a lot of developments and a lot of gaps in energy infrastructure. So what makes Nord Stream 2 so controversial? So on the one hand, you have proponents of the project who are calling it a commercial deal, right? They're there to develop the infrastructure. They're there to make gas delivery easier, better, more competitive prices, right? And then on the other hand, you have the opponents of the project who are saying that clearly this is a Russian project that's going to threaten European energy security, Ukrainian strategic stability. So if, like you say in the title, this isn't a pipe, then what are we talking about?
Right, this isn't a pipe. In point of fact, it is a pipe, but it is not just, it maybe not just a pipe. It represents a lot of other systemic issues in the transatlantic security space, and also on Europe's own coming to terms with its energy security. So I thought I'd start with kind of giving you a little bit of a timeline, just so folks know what Nord Stream is, where we've come from, and know that this is not a breaking new issue, although it's at a critical point right now. So it might surprise you when you hear that this was announced originally. The first Nord Stream pipeline was announced all the way back in 2003 between Tony Blair and Vladimir Putin in a conference in London, and this followed the TNK-BP merger. And the idea originally was to have gas coming from near St. Petersburg, originating in Siberia and the Yamal Peninsula, and moving all the way across the Baltic Sea and then on to the United Kingdom. This was dropped just a few years later, and it sat dormant because of deteriorating relations between the United Kingdom and the Russian Federation. This kind of sat on the shelf until 2005. When Gerhard Schroeder, while in office, promoted Nord Stream 1. I'll go back to that right here. So Gerhard Schroeder, former Chancellor of Germany, supported Nord Stream 1 while in office and oversaw the signing of an agreement between the Russian and German governments to support the project and have German companies involved in this. This was a few weeks before the 2005 Bundestag election, and Gerhard Schroeder lost that election. The SPD lost the election. And Chancellor Merkel came in with the CDU shortly thereafter. The interesting thing is that just a few weeks after that, Schroeder traveled to St. Petersburg and became the CEO of the then named Northern European gas pipeline, which would become Nord Stream 1. So it's this sort of trend that has leaders, especially in the Baltic states, saying that this is the Schroederization of Europe. This is some term that's come up in the past basically year and a half. I'll talk about the line of Schroederized officials getting longer a little bit later in this story, but let's get back to Nord Stream 1. So Nord Stream 1 is a pipeline that was built between basically 2009 and 2013. It consists of two parallel trunk lines that are bringing gas from Vyborg in Russia, a compressor station there, all the way across the Baltic Sea. Each has a 27.5 billion cubic meters per year BCMA capacity. That's a volumetric capacity, that how much the pipeline can move per year. And basically the first trunk line became operational in 2011, and then the second one became operational in 2013. So as Nord Stream 1 was becoming operational, there were already discussions, should there be a Nord Stream 2, should we move this forward? And something happened in November 2013 through early in the winter 2014. That was the Euromaidan protests. So that was followed by the March 2014 annexation of Crimea by the Russian Federation, and then the war in Donbass began shortly thereafter. So this was shelved, and you might think, okay, that would have been the end of the project, but just about a little over 15 months later, in summer of 2015, the Nord Stream 2 consortium basically got back together, and they announced that the project was going to be moving forward. This is a partnership that was going to be at the start basically 50% owned by Gazprom and 10% each owned by OMV of Austria, Wintershall, BASF Wintershall of Germany, Uniper in Germany, which was then Aon, ENGIE in France, and Royal Dutch Shell in the Netherlands. At the same time that happened, OMV and Wintershall signed asset swap agreements with Gazprom, so we'll get back to that a little bit later about what are maybe the economic drivers, if it's not really about energy security, of what that means. And then basically that got us to where we are in the kind of the current discussion of Nord Stream 2. This became an immediate controversy because of what was going on then and still is going on in Ukraine, and because of its impacts, which I'll get to a little bit later. So in summer of 2016, that consortium that I talked about was broken up due to a successful legal challenge by the Polish UOKiK antitrust agency, and that forced Gazprom to basically own the project at 100% level. A few months later, the five Western companies came back into the fold and said they were going to give, I believe it's called non-equity financing. Basically, they're going to give financing to the project and be partners, but not actually be shareholders in the project, so they wouldn't run afoul of antitrust. In the summer of 2017, the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, or CAATSA, was passed by the U.S. Senate, and that allowed for discretionary sanctions on Russian energy export pipelines, including Nord Stream 2 and Turkish Stream, that allowed the administration at the time to make that call should it decide to do so. Later in 2017, Denmark passed a law allowing it to take into account foreign and security policy in its approvals of Nord Stream 2 through its own territorial waters, which I will come back to when we go through the map in a moment. In spring of 2018, Finland and Sweden finally offered its approvals to have the pipeline built in its exclusive economic zone, because it was limited under the UN Law of the Sea from basically hindering the project in any way in that area of the Baltic. In fall of so basically that allowed for construction to begin in the spring of 2018. Still lacking a Danish permit, the Nord Stream AG applied for a permit to move the pipeline route through the EEZ of Denmark between Sweden and Bornholm in the Baltic Sea. And let's see, that's almost up to the present. And then Gazprom ultimately put in a third route option south of Bornholm, and I'll go through that in a moment. And then finally, this summer, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and House Foreign Affairs Committee passed sanctions legislation that would basically sanction critical technologies and vessels required to build the pipeline itself, or basically allow it to complete the pipeline construction. And then that OPAL decision was done just a few weeks ago. So the question is, as we go forward, is there going to be a crisis at the end of the year? And that's the discussion I'd like to have later on. But that's the story of Nord Stream 2. So you kind of have the history of where this all came from.
So what has been the U.S. response kind of more concretely? What's the U.S. position toward Nord Stream other than the ability to put on sanctions? We also know that for the past year or so, the U.S. has been a net exporter of natural gas. So is there any indication that any U.S. opposition to Nord Stream might come from the desire to export gas and be a participant in the European gas market as well?
Yeah, I think that has been, in a way, transformational. The U.S. has become a net LNG exporter after its first export of gas from Cheniere in Louisiana in 2016. But that's often a narrative that's pushed by Nord Stream 2 supporters, saying that the only reason, quote unquote, that the U.S. opposes Nord Stream 2 is that it wants to just capture the market for itself, or stop it so that it can sell LNG in its place. The problem with that are a few things, and I'll skip a slide and go up to this. Actually, I'll go back to the pipeline map for a moment. Okay, so the idea of Nord Stream 2 is specifically aimed at diverting gas that normally would be going through the Ukrainian unified gas transmission system, and instead route it through the Baltic Sea to Lubmin in Germany, the Lubmin gas hub in the German state of Mecklenburg-Vorpommern. So the idea there is, if there's not basically been full success by the Russian Federation to economically or strategically destabilize Ukraine and its actions so far, this would be just another arrow towards that process. But this idea that Nord Stream 2 being stopped would be an opening for U.S. LNG overlooks the fact that this is not bringing significant new gas volumes to Europe itself. The onshore portion of Nord Stream 2 has a technical breakdown of gas, and where the gas is going really tells you what it's doing. Only 9.9, so this is a 55 billion cubic meter per year pipeline. Only 9.9 BCMA of that is going to Germany and points west. The rest is going down through the Czech Republic to the Baumgarten gas hub in Austria, which, oh, by the way, is the end point of the current Ukrainian gas transmission route. So this is basically just a giant swap. And folks in the Kremlin have said this many times. That is their goal, that they want to end gas transit to Ukraine by the end of 2019, which is really where the strategic concern is. Now, it is possible that some of this gas, once it gets through the Czech Republic to Baumgarten or to southern Germany, will reverse flow into Western Europe. But the whole point is that if Nord Stream 2 is stopped, gas will just continue to flow at the same volumes through the Ukrainian gas transmission system rather than being rerouted. So this idea that if we stop Nord Stream 2, we being the U.S. stops Nord Stream 2, that we'll just have a 55 billion cubic meter a year market to sell it in, that just doesn't hold up, because that's not a net change. Most of the U.S. exported gas so far has gone to Asia and to South America, and that's really been a natural market for us. All the liquidity in the market that has come from that export has helped for optionality in Europe, so it's helped European energy security, but it's not so far been a natural market to sell U.S. gas directly to Europe.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So then, what are some of the other motivations for the U.S. to oppose Nord Stream 2? Is it really just U.S. commitment to stability in Ukraine, stability in Poland, Eastern Europe, or are there some other motivations? Is this really just about Ukraine, Poland, the Baltics, or is it a much bigger picture?
Yeah, and it's really a discussion of strategic stability in a few areas. I generally say that there's four main reasons that the U.S. has opposed Nord Stream 2. Number one is that it basically does the opposite of all of those things that I laid out in the 5 pillars of energy security at the start of the conversation. If constructed and completed, Nord Stream 2 would concentrate approximately 70 to 80% of Russian gas exports to the EU through a single corridor. And that has really, fundamentally physical security, technical security concerns from the fact that that Nord Stream 2 runs through a number of large-scale chemical and conventional munitions dumping sites from both basically the post-World War II era and the Soviet era, where you can see these areas in pink and orange in the central Baltic and throughout the Gulf of Finland. So the idea there is, if there's a mine that washes up, or if there's some sort of geomorphology that changes on the seabed, does that expose the pipeline to a stoppage or a physical security risk? And the answer is yes. And you might say, and I've been challenged a number of times, will this ever happen? Well, it's already happened with Nord Stream 1. In 2015, a weapons object, or basically a naval object, was found near the Nord Stream 1 pipeline, which required the Swedish Coast Guard to go out and take it from the seabed, and that required Nord Stream 1 to be stopped for a number of weeks. So this, if you're basically funneling more and more gas through that one corridor, you're creating a physical security risk. So that's number one. That over concentrates. It goes against diversification of source countries and routes. Number one, it has a direct impact on Ukrainian strategic stability, which is let's see, where is this? Right here. Which is linked to a number of factors. Number one, this would lose Ukraine several $billion in terms of gas transit revenues, and that's often thought of. That's the main reason that Ukraine wants to keep this going. It's not the only reason. Certainly, that would get rid of a few percent of the Ukrainian GDP overnight, which many estimates have had in the amount that is commensurate with the defense budget of Ukraine. So again, getting rid of something that is of the size of the defense budget of Ukraine is not good for a country that's being attacked on a daily basis. So that's number one. The other thing is that there is a strategic deterrence that the Russian Federation currently relies on the gas transmission network in Ukraine to move its own gas through Ukraine into Europe. And that's really important because at the end of the day, if the Russian Federation is making money from Europe to have this keep going through Ukraine, there is basically a physical security deterrent when it comes to the situation in the war in eastern Ukraine. And it's no surprise that some of the gas pipelines that Gazprom still relies on to get that gas across Ukraine and into Europe directly circumscribes the line of contact in Donbass. And I was in eastern Ukraine last year and talked to folks on the ground about this, and they pointed this out readily, that this was the case. So that is a strategic hard security concern. That it's not to say that that the gas turns off, the tanks roll tomorrow sort of thing, but it's one less deterrent to destabilizing any activities further into eastern Ukraine. The other thing is there's been major Gazprom supply cutoffs of Ukraine in the past. In 2006, the last big one was in 2009, in 2014, and then just last year in 2018. And that had to do with the Stockholm arbitration decision. And that was a decision that came out on the 28th of February of 2018, and basically I can go through the details later if folks would like, but the bottom line is that Gazprom, because of the ruling of the take-or-pay contract from 2009, owed Naftogaz $2.56 billion, and that was an arbitration that both sides entered into freely. So with their displeasure of that case result, 6 or 8 hours later at midnight, the gas volumes that an earlier case in the Stockholm arbitration required Naftogaz to pre-purchase from Gazprom, and that the Ukrainian public was waiting to have delivered for domestic use from the Russian Federation, was cut off. So not all gas, but that amount that Ukraine had been required by the earlier arbitration case to purchase it. So what that did was an immediate energy security crisis, and the hope is believed that that basically Gazprom and the Kremlin were hoping that the bad old days of Ukraine would return, where gas was siphoned off that would have been going on to Europe, and give more fuel to the notion that Ukraine is an unreliable energy supplier. But what happened was actually pretty inspiring. It was this campaign that was done, the "We're Not Frozen Yet" campaign, that basically had the Ukrainian public be encouraged to turn down their thermostats by 2 or 3 degrees each day to reduce consumption, and then government buildings and schools were shuttered and things like this. And in the end, Ukraine was able to use their own pre-developed post-2014 SOS, security of supply regulations, and secure all of that gas so that it all got to end users in Europe, while at the same time reducing consumption by a percentage that was able to allow that not to have basically major outages. So that was really encouraging. But again, this all comes back to Ukrainian strategic stability. And then, of course, this idea of malign influence is in the back of everyone's mind as well. We, of course, have the foundational case maybe of Gerhard Schroeder, but you skip ahead to Nord Stream 2, and this just continues of former European officials that have moved or promoted Nord Stream 2 and other Gazprom projects to get these basically positions at Russian state-owned enterprises. So that includes Austria's ex-finance minister last year becoming a senior advisor for Nord Stream 2, and just a few weeks ago, Christian Kern, former Austrian chancellor, became board of director of Russian Railways. So again, that's a question of basically foundational sovereignty, and who are your politicians to account for. So that's kind of what has been the motivation of this policy discussion.
So let's have one final question just to kind of bring us up to the present day. You laid out at the beginning the elements that are shaping current security policy, energy policy. So we have the continued development of Nord Stream that you've been talking about, the implication of lots of politicians from countries that are theoretically Ukraine's allies. We also have the expiration of the current transit contract between Gazprom and Naftogaz. That's at the end of this year. Then we also have new leadership in Ukraine, and like you said, new leadership in the European Commission. So what is the likelihood of a gas crisis at the end of this year, and what do you foresee in terms of energy market reforms in Ukraine?
First of all, do I think there's going to be a gas crisis at the end of the year? The answer is yes, but it's caveated by the fact that I think that Europe is more prepared than it has been in the past. So if gas crisis, if that metric is, will there not be a gas contract and gas may stop flowing through Ukraine after the 1st of January, that might be the case. I don't know for how long that would be able to be sustained. But at least in the short term, the EU has all of its gas storages basically fully complete. I think fully topped off at 96 or more percent. And Ukraine is 4 billion cubic meters more of gas capacity in storage right now than they have in recent years. So there are preparations in place. But yeah, this confluence of a number of things really is coming to a head, because you have, on one hand, the continued development of Nord Stream 2, the Danish approvals for a potential EEZ route south of Bornholm continues to be considered. So that's a question of whether that is going to push Nord Stream 2 out from its intended completion date at the end of this year, which I genuinely don't think, even if they got the permit today, they could reach. Is the Hill going to move forward with Nord Stream 2 sanctions on pipelaying vessels and critical technologies? Again, the idea there, as I understand it, is to limit the, not do a broad sectoral sanction that would hit a number of European companies, but just a few very acute sanctions that would stop the threat of Nord Stream 2 without having this large backlash by a unilateral sectoral sanction. The OPAL decision, which I do want to mention now, has given the EU a more robust tool in terms of its regulation of Nord Stream 2. And that's because of what the OPAL decision did. So the OPAL decision, again, so OPAL is the onshore portion of Nord Stream 1. And from 2016 until now, it has operated outside of the EU's third energy package regulations in terms of third-party access. That means that Gazprom basically has brought all of the gas it wants through Nord Stream 1 and was able to use the OPAL pipeline at near full capacity to bring gas onwards from Nord Stream 1 into Europe. That shouldn't be the case under EU law, and basically the exemption it was given was challenged by Poland in a suit in the European General Court of the European Court of Justice, joined by Latvia and Lithuania. And the ruling was basically this, that and I had to memorize this, the Treaty for the Founding of the European Unions, Article 194 says that there is something known as a solidarity principle that basically has member states required under EU law to look at the impacts that piece of energy infrastructure would have, not only of the localized region of their country, but also on other member states in the area and the Union as a whole. Nord Stream 1/OPAL didn't do that. It was that regulation was that assessment was only done very localized and did not look at the impacts on Poland and the Baltic states, et cetera. So that's why it was ruled that that exemption can no longer continue. So you have that, but at the same time, that update to the gas directive ensuring that the third energy package applies to pipelines originating in third-party countries, in this case the Nord Stream 2 pipeline in the Russian Federation, have to then undergo something called Article 11 assessment. And the Article 11 assessment has basically the same analog to the solidarity principle. It has to force the national regulator, in this case Germany's Bundesnetzagentur, to assess the pipeline based on its national security and energy security impact on other member states. And so the question is, I don't know how the Bundesnetzagentur is going to be able to get that through either its own assessment or the European Commission approval, given that objectively there are concerns and impacts on other EU member states by the construction and operation of Nord Stream 2. But now you have case law sitting there as well from this OPAL decision. So that's going to continue. As I said, at the same time, you have new European commissioners coming in, and they may have a different view on this. Margaret Vestager, who is a previous commissioner, who's now going to be an executive vice president, has called Nord Stream 2 not a European project. And at the same time, you have a new leadership in Kyiv that are going to have to move forward with trilateral negotiations, the first of which took place last week. And unfortunately, the results of that have been somewhat uninspiring. Gazprom continues to make as a prerequisite that Ukraine drop that 2.56 billion arbitration win before they have any discussion on a future gas contract. So that's really concerning, and that's why I think that we only have 3 months to go, and leaders really need to be urgent in their decision-making process on all of this melange of things that are going on.
Mm-hmm. Great. I am going to stop asking questions and let the attendees of this lecture ask some
I've got
questions.
one more.
You have one more. Sorry.
Right here.
Oh, right.
So this is the question. So if Heiko Maas in his meeting with former Ukrainian Foreign Minister Pavlo Klimkin says we don't consider Nord Stream 2 to be a political project, I'm not sure what is. So that's you can read Klimkin's face having that sort of reaction. So I'll just leave it at that, and then
Super.
There's a lot more we can talk about.
Yeah.
And looking forward to it.
I certainly have other questions if we don't have, but let's open the floor. We have about 45 minutes left, so we have plenty of time. Yeah, go ahead.
So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the capacity that's already built out in all areas of Europe to maybe import LNG or other kind of sources of natural gas that could be quickly accessed if needed in the winter.
Yeah. So let's go back to the map. There are a number of LNG terminals that have been developed, but the problem is, up until the past few years, most of the LNG capacity has been on the Iberian Peninsula and in basically the North Sea, and not at the areas that are more vulnerable to cutoffs in Central and Eastern Europe. And that's why the U.S. over the past several years focused on the support of LNG infrastructure in Eastern Europe, so it's nearer to the end user, and also to interconnect some of these Iberian LNG terminals. Most of these are operating at 25% or less capacity per year. So there's a lot of spare capacity. The problem is there's a physical bottleneck getting through basically getting off the Iberian Peninsula through France and into Central and Eastern Europe. And that's something that, this is called the MidCat pipeline. That's something that the European Commission continues to help push forward, and hopefully that will unlock this kind of large unused capacity and energy potential to move gas where it might need to go in a security contingency. At the same time, there are some good stories. The Klaipėda terminal in Lithuania has opened in 2016. In the past few years, there's been an opening and expansion of the LNG terminal at Świnoujście in Poland, and there's been increased capacity of the Revithoussa terminal in Greece. Again, the idea is those are all great, but you need to have this north-south interconnection infrastructure in place in order to move forward that liquidity in the Central and Eastern European market. So you have kind of these anchors of where LNG can come in, but they right now can't get everywhere they need to go. So that's infrastructure that still has to be built.
Thank you for this presentation. I have a question about the shale gas revolution, and to what degree it is a European phenomenon, and what does it do to the energy security of Europe and Ukraine as well. I understand that there were some plans. I don't know whether there are actual production of shale gas in Ukraine.
So I haven't really followed the production of shale gas itself in Ukraine. I know it's not really. I mean, the potential for domestic production writ large is a huge potential, and that's really something that Ukraine can increase its energy security with. And it has already tremendous gas storage facilities, and it can be the battery of Europe, but again, you have to have the interconnectors to get the gas there. The shale gas revolution in the United States has transformed the market worldwide, because we're now the largest LNG exporter. And that really has added a level of liquidity that we're moving closer to the day that LNG, like oil, is much more fungible on the global market. So that a supply disruption in one place doesn't actually have this widespread interruption elsewhere. The geology, as I understand it, in Ukraine is there. In Poland, it might not be. So there's kind of a regional disparity in terms of where the shale gas is or is accessible. Some of the bedrock is just too deep for it to be economic. But that's a possibility across Europe. But at the end of the day, there's a lot of NIMBY concerns, not in my backyard concerns. So some countries are embracing that, and some are not. Some that would like to embrace it, maybe like Poland, don't have the ability to. Some that could do that, like Germany, are saying that they don't want to do it. So it's kind of that disparity that is still in the way.
Yeah, right.
Hi.
Hey.
So very interesting presentation. I really enjoy it. I have basically two comments, and maybe we can discuss it.
Sure.
So the first point is the European Court took a decision in early September, and they annulled the decision taken by the European Commission on OPAL. So Gazprom cannot get the full capacity, the full transport capacity.
Yeah, 12 of 35, 12 BCMA of 35.
Yeah, so technically they can use 84% of Nord Stream 1 capacity, and since Nord Stream 2, so they have delay right now, so one can imagine a short-term agreement between Ukraine and Russia, because Gazprom's room for maneuver is progressively decreasing. So I think this won't be a long-term transit contract, but Gazprom needs to nominate transport capacity a few days ahead. So maybe there will be something. And the second point, so you gave the US perspective, and since I am an EU citizen, so I will also give the European perspective. So
Great.
Basically, yeah. So basically, the problem with Nord Stream is neither Russia nor Ukraine, but this is a European problem, and more specifically, a German problem, because Germany is going through the Energiewende, the energy transition, and it is quite messy right now because the German energy mix is becoming less and less diversified. So no nuclear energy, and now due to the environment, due to the Paris Agreement, they also have to reduce coal consumption. And as a consequence, Germany is increasing gas consumption, and especially gas from Russia. And as you mentioned, so in Europe we have this solidarity concept. So
Right.
it was coined after the 2009 gas crisis. And basically each EU member state has to support the neighboring country in case of crisis. And now, so Germany, the new solidarity risk Germany is forcing its neighbors to carry is quite questionable, because this lack of diversification has consequences and is putting pressure on other EU member states. And basically, in case of gas supply disruption, other EU member states, so for example Poland, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, etc., they will have to reduce industrial gas consumption to provide gas for residential customers in Germany. And this change is really questioning the very sense of the solidarity concept in Europe. So in my opinion, the problem is also German.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the Energiewende has brought about a huge dynamical change in the energy market in Central Europe in general. The concern, I mean, I guess the question I have and point out to friends in Germany on this Nord Stream 2 specific discussion, there's this idea that there's going to be this import gap that needs to be filled, and that's really one of the tropes that Gazprom pushes a lot in its messaging. And the answer is, I would agree. I think that based on the most conservative estimates, you might have an import gap, quote unquote, of up to 110, 115 BCMA. And that's what Nord Stream 2 quotes as well. I agree with that. The difference in my assessment is that the total spare import capacity of all import pipelines coming from outside the EU, inside the EU itself, fully covers that gap in unused capacity, whether it be from Ukraine or Yamal or Northern Africa, et cetera, and from the North Sea. And at the same time, the pipeline's not being built to bring significant new gas to Germany. If it was, I mean, that would be a big different, different discussion that we'd be having. But it's clearly bringing it to the endpoint of the Ukrainian gas transit system, which really raises concerns of why this is being done. And I think that's the one slide that I missed, which I would like to point out. There was a report by, I'm sure you've read this. This is the infamous or famous Russian oil and gas tickling giants spare bank report from last year, in which it was stated in this assessment that the Power of Siberia pipeline, that's a pipeline that would bring Russian gas to China in the east. Turkish Stream, which is basically Nord Stream 2's twin through the Black Sea to the Balkan region, and Nord Stream 2 are all, quote, deeply value-disruptive projects that will eat up almost half of Gazprom's investments over the next 5 years. They're commonly perceived as being foisted on the company by the government pursuing a geopolitical agenda. This got the author fired almost immediately, but it's important to look at these sort of things because the analysis that he has here, for example, shows that the years to break even from launch for Power Siberia is 16, Turkish Stream is 47 years, and Nord Stream 2 is 20 years. So these are not being done simply as commercial projects. That's why I often say it's not, quote, not just a commercial deal, but from Gazprom's perspective, or from the Russian perspective, it's doing exactly what it intends to do, which is to enrich targeted oligarchs or subcontractors in the Russian Federation, including the Rotenberg brothers and Timchenko, through the construction of upstream pipelines in the Russian Federation. And the commercial, why is it commercial for the companies? Well, on the left here, you can see BASF and OMV, among others, have signed long-term asset swap agreements in the Russian Federation that happened within days of the Nord Stream 2 signing. So you have that kind of, it might be economic for the companies, but not because of the operation of the pipeline itself. Not because these companies, aside from perhaps OMV, are going to get significant volumes themselves. So that's where this question comes into play, and that's where that question of, to me, I mean, I spoke at a conference in DC on this topic on Monday, and I was asked, what in European energy security and these sort of things, what keeps you up at night? And my concern is that is this this line of Schroederized officials and things like that as it gets longer and longer, and obviously this is in the headlines in a lot of other sectors as well. Are European countries and frankly folks in the U.S. Are they acting in a way that undermines our collective ability to stand up to Russian pressure on NATO's eastern flank and in the West writ large? And I said kind of flippantly, but I think it's at least a comparison that for Putin, a lot of these officials are like Pokemon. He's got to catch them all. So some people in the room find that funny. That's great. Okay. Anyways, but that's really the thing. It's not just about energy in itself. It's the amount of money that's sitting around these projects that can be used for conduits of malign influence and basically what I heard Senator Sheldon Whitehouse say at a congressional hearing about a year and a half ago, allow for kind of the two spheres of the world to continue to merge, where you have corrupt land moving into rule of law land and pushing back on some of our fundamental assumptions about economic drivers and democracy. So that's something that I think can't be overlooked in this discussion. I don't know if that answers your question, but
yeah, it wasn't
okay.
A question, but just a comment.
Okay.
You spoke earlier, or somebody did, of shale gas exploitation as perhaps a way for Ukraine to solve some of its energy needs. Are there any other alternatives for Ukraine? And I think in particular about geothermal exploitation for district heating purposes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that the idea of using parts of this comes up in the discussion of, well, if Nord Stream 2 is built and the Ukrainian gas transmission system then is defunct, can you do something with it? I've heard discussions of using it for biogas, for example. You see that in Denmark, for example. The Danes have used some basically abandoned or former oil and gas pipelines for that purpose. So you can repurpose to a clean energy, energy future, even though the dirty gas the dirty energy can be used, the infrastructure can be used to push that forward. So that's a possibility. I'm not sure what the geothermal possibilities are in Ukraine itself, but that's certainly something to look into. It would be something down in the strata, obviously, but. And the potential for wind energy and solar is huge in Ukraine, and the offshore, potential for offshore wind farms is huge as well, in the Black Sea and in the Azov Sea, frankly. So.
How vulnerable are these facilities in the case of a conflict?
Sorry, could you be more specific than that?
I mean,
I would say hugely vulnerable, depending on
a shooting war.
So, I mean, that's when I talk about NATO interoperability and energy security from that perspective, I remember talking to colleagues at the Defense Logistics Agency, and they will say, so they are in charge of basically all the fuel supply chains to get energy resources and refined products to our service personnel, both U.S. and NATO forces that we're cooperating with. And they said that no matter what the contingency, they're going to get the fuel where it needs to go, but there are better ways of doing it. Obviously, if something can be swapped out, if there's a grid, you can leverage domestic infrastructure or refineries in the host nation. So that's why in the Baltic states, in particular, where our rotational presence is, you really have that looking over your shoulder of how can we both A, better integrate with the existing NATO pipeline network, and B, look at the ownership structures of some of the facilities that we collectively rely on for operational energy security, basically jet fuel for F-35s, for example. And so that's something that that is, that has to be addressed to increase the resiliency and reduce the vulnerabilities. In terms of, I guess, kinetic attack, that's something that's more, the Pentagon would know more of how to do that defense. But cyber, I mean, all of those things in terms of protection and resiliency is vital there. So.
Yes, I have two questions maybe and a comment. As a policy designer, I'm extremely interested in this Nord Stream 1 and 2. So what do you think? Because Germans are doing this energy vendor, so changing the energy. And of course, the one goal is clear, so to have a clear energy. But there's a second one hidden. And in the this year in Poland, the book about this energy van was issued, and the author claims that Germany has have the hidden goal, so to dominate the Central Europe by using this gas, which will be sent through the Nord Stream 1. So they will buy gas from Russia, then send to Germany, and Germans. Thanks to the existing infrastructure, which is from south to the from east to the west, not from north to the south.
Right.
Yes. So, what do you think about? Is it possible? Is it a project or is only some gossip?
Sorry. What is it? What is the project?
This sending from gas from Russia and to Germany and re-export to the Central Europe.
I mean, that's right. So I mean, that's I think the goal there. I mean, it's to turn, basically change the center of gravity of most of the volumetric capacity in Europe from this this east to west legacy infrastructure to something that is more basically centered in Germany, Czech, Austria, and that small area, and then radiating it out. So there is capacity for reverse flows because of the development of the third energy package, which requires dual capacity or dual directional capacity on all of these interconnectors to move gas that would be coming from Nord Stream 2, for example, into Poland, into Slovakia, and even back into Ukraine theoretically. So so that is certainly possible. But again, it's the drive is to overcome the legacy infrastructure that was built during the Soviet Union, and that is an axis that basically has always brought gas from the Russian Federation through to end users in that area in the Warsaw Pact countries. So you have the Yamal pipeline that was built that goes to end users in Belarus and Poland. Now it goes in, I guess, in eastern Germany at that point. It's still operating that direction. Same thing through Ukraine. That's why this 3 Seas initiative and the North-South gas corridor was formed, to kind of break that axis and create a network. Because if you kind of zoom out and you only see the bigger pipelines, this is maybe not the best map to look at that, but you can see here that this basically the entire Western European market is networked. It's really interconnected very well and very mature, whereas the Eastern European network wasn't, because it wasn't allowed to. It was that holding, basically Russia to end user. So you can, if you have an issue with Belarus, the Kremlin could cut off Belarus. If it is an issue with Ukraine, it could cut off Ukraine. That sort of end user approach needs to be overcome by this north-south corridor that breaks that access.
Did you have a second question?
Yes. So my second question is also connected to Poland. Is it possible to build some connection between Poland and Ukraine and to the Polish LNG ports in Świnoujście and Gdańsk and send through this new line the American gas? Is it possible to make it fast or?
Yes. The answer is yes. I know that there have been reports of Polish and Ukrainian leaders working on this. There's only missing. Right, exactly, and it's only you're only missing like 100 kilometers or something of it's not that long of an interconnector, not that expensive an interconnector that would need to be built to do that. Whether it can bring the exact physical volume from the Świnoujście terminal or potentially a floating storage and regasification unit at Gdansk, which is the potential to expand LNG imports in Poland to Ukraine, remains to be seen. Part of the reason is with LNG, you don't necessarily have to have the gas go from the ship into the pipes and go to the end user in all contingencies, because you can do swaps, for either virtual or physical swaps, that allow that volume to offset gas that would be otherwise imported from somewhere else down the pipeline, so to speak.
So I guess this is a bit of a hypothetical. Let's say Denmark doesn't do the approval and it's an average winter. Is the supplies that you mentioned in Ukraine and Europe enough to let Europe replace the fuel they have now lost if Gazprom also doesn't do a deal with these excess capacity in the alternative routes?
Well, the part of the problem is the alternative routes. A lot of them, the excess capacity is also originating in the Russian Federation. So if Russia is cutting off the Ukrainian route, it's unlikely to use Yamal as a swing supply or Nord Stream 1 as a swing supply. Part of the reason that they're operating at nearly full capacity already, which has allowed for decreases in the nominal Ukrainian gas flows over the past several years, just with Nord Stream 1. Mm-hmm. So that is certainly a possibility. The gas storage supplies, I think that the SOS regulations require 90 days of supply for each member state.
The whole winter.
Right. So again, when I say crisis, again, it's not necessarily going to be as bad as in 2009 when you had real cutoffs that in the coldest part of the winter, people were freezing to death. You know, this a friend of mine often says, like, imagine you were in Denver, Colorado in the middle of the winter, and you had to make a decision to go to a public park to cut down trees to keep your house warm because of a gas dispute between Canada and Mexico. Right? That's what happened to people in Bulgaria. So that was, effectively. So that's the sort of thing that that you have to keep in mind. Now, at the end of the year, for this specter of a gas contract dispute and potential cutoff and things like that, I think that Gazprom is using that as central to its push to get Nord Stream 2 finished. Again, I don't think that it can. I know it cannot be physically built and operated and operationalized and everything by the end of the year at this point, because it's just, you might be able to finish the physical pipeline, but you still have to, do things like coating the inside and testing the compressor stations and things like that. So, from a maritime perspective, that is there's a lot to be taken into account from the steps that still need to be taken to finish this in the Baltic Sea. So I think that regardless, Nord Stream 2 is not going to be done exactly at the end of the year, which, to Arlie's point, is why a short-term contract might be what Gazprom ultimately goes for. But in the short term, I think they're using this leverage of a potential gas cutoff of Ukraine with this ending of the gas contract to push Nord Stream 2 forward and say that, look, U.S. Congress, don't sanction that. Danes, you better say yes. And European Commission, you better think twice if you want us to try to comply with the third energy package, because it's going to be difficult, as I said earlier, to make that case that it doesn't negatively impact the national or energy security of other member states at the end of the day, especially with the OPAL decision now in play. So.
Sorry. You mentioned the reverse gas flow capacity,
Yep.
and I was just wondering if you have a good sense for the Ukrainian transmission system's technical ability to handle reverse flows for more than a short amount of time.
So they can from Poland and Hungary and Slovakia. They have done that for several years now, and that's why until basically I believe the 1st of March of last year, when they were compelled to start importing I think 4 BCM per year of Russian gas directly. They hadn't for 18 to 24 months directly imported gas from the Russian Federation for their own domestic use. After the annexation of Crimea and war in Donbass began back in 2014, the EU and the US came together with a huge diplomatic push to make sure that reverse flows from Poland, Hungary, and Slovakia were possible. And they are. And that's exactly what happened when the cutoff happened last year. The reason that Ukraine was able to hold out for those few days with their reduced consumption, and then things were able to go back to normal, was because Poland and Hungary in particular were able to, in that 48 hours, sign agreements with Naftogaz and bring gas to offset that cut into Ukraine.
I was interested if you could talk more about that report that got the guy fired, about how
Yep.
Gazprom, if they were to do all 3 of these projects, right, that it would take up more than half of their capital or something. You said what?
They're deeply valued. I'm just going to read exactly what it says. Almost half of Gazprom's investments over the next 5 years. So, sorry, what was your question in particular?
I just wanted you to comment more about what does this mean then if Gazprom goes through with this and they are so spread thin? What does that mean for kind of gas production, development, sending out?
Yeah, well, I mean, you have to remember the point that this report made in the end is that it's actually Gazprom, as an entity, is succeeding in its goals. It's just not market commercial, goals in the end. It's to send preferential contracts to local oligarchs along the route. If you look at the route of the Power of Siberia pipeline, it's hardly the most efficient route out there. It goes hin and yonder around Vladivostok and elsewhere in Russia's Far East. So there's that sort of dynamic within the Russian Federation, and then again targeting Western companies that then accede to companies and officials that then accede to both Gazprom's objectives and the Kremlin's geopolitical objectives. Remember, these guys, the Schroeder Ice folks, don't just talk about gas. They generally don't talk specifically about Russian energy. There's a lot of times where they'll talk about that sanctions unity in the West should be broken, or we should reduce sanctions on Russia for its annexation of Crimea, for example, things like that. So that is I think exactly what it's being used for. And again, it's not in a market economy in the sense it's starting in the Russian Federation, where you have these being state-owned enterprises that can be subsidized. So if Putin wants to build this for $50 billion, you can take it from elsewhere in the economy, which normal companies don't have the luxury of doing. I've often heard a couple of times at debates that I had in Brussels, someone said, well, it shouldn't matter if they build Nord Stream 2. If Gazprom builds Nord Stream 2, the Ukrainian route should just become better run and more competitive, economically competitive. It's a better option. And that kind of falls apart when you see that to steal the "There will be blood" Daniel Plainview line, the straw goes into the same milkshake, for the multiple straws. So they're competing against a non-competitive market that's all the same market. So they can't you can't compete one against the other if the same company is holding the ends of both pipes.
Maybe one more question. You mentioned sanctions, and I wonder what do sanctions do to these projects, and also generally to Russia's oil and gas industry in terms of its capacity acquire new equipment and developing new technology, bring in.
Yeah, so the sanctions regime the U.S. has had for the past several years in its Russia sanctions program for energy has focused on three main areas: deep water offshore oil and gas production, unconventional energy technologies, so fracking, for example, fracking technologies, and Arctic development. And so that has been mostly, in fact, almost primarily focused on the oil sector and new technologies in the oil sector. The Nord Stream 2 sanctions are a little bit different, the various proposed sanctions. The CAATSA sanctions that actually came out and that were discretionary basically are kind of a blanket approach where it would be sanctioning firms operating in the Russian, cooperating and supporting the Russian energy export pipeline sector. So that would be, if that lever was pulled by by folks on Capitol Hill or the administration, that could potentially be viewed by some as much more damaging because it would hit these European majors potentially, like BASF, Wintershall, Uniper, Gazprom, NG, and World Dutch Shell. So there's that one. The other sanctions bills that have come out over the summer, and these were both passed by almost unanimous consent in the House Foreign Affairs Committee and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee at the end of July. Those are specifically focused on pipeline technologies and vessel technologies that are supporting the physical construction of the project. So that, I guess the view there is that you would be sanctioning a few firms if they didn't comply, obviously, and drop out of the project. You'd be sanctioning only a few parts of a few firms. And the company that's actually laying the physical pipeline itself is Allseas, and there's not that many firms in the world that have this sort of technology that can lay pipe at that scale, at that depth. So the idea there is that it's more along the lines maybe of a what you see in the DPRK, the North Korean sanctions context, where you sanction vessels for breaking certain energy trade rules rather than an entire sector. But again, the question is, are those actually going to pass? So they pass committee, that's not law. And if the pipeline is physically completed, then that sort of sanctions approach doesn't work at all because then the technology doesn't have any impediment. But in terms of impacts in the Russian Federation, that's, again, it's not even, it's not a sectoral sanction, so I don't think it would have that much of an impact except for on the project itself.
Any final questions?
I just have a kind of a general question. So it looks like in the immediate future, we're not going to need any less gas. Germany now needs more gas, and gas being used as a lever in geopolitics. But what's a kind of a long-term future of gas industry in 50 years or 100 years? Are we going to need less gas? Are we moving towards reducing dependence on gas, or?
So in 50 years, that is 10 years more than the 40 years I talked about for fusion.
Yeah.
So maybe we have fusion by then, and we're all set. Again, that's turning deuterium, which is refined seawater, into basically nuclear energy that doesn't have a significant radioactive waste product. Like there's some, but not anywhere near the scale of nuclear fission that you use for civil nuclear today. I mean, I think the hope, obviously, of me, certainly as a scientist and as a technologist, is that renewable energy technologies plus something like fusion plus maybe a mix of conventional nuclear energy can get us away from hydrocarbons by then. I mean, I think we're going to be in big trouble if we're not. So we better hurry up. And things like geothermal that's looking at you have so looking at technologies of the future that can get us there are things like geothermal, things using heat vents at the bottom of the sea, for example, stuff like that, all the way through higher efficiency photovoltaics for better conversion of solar energy, solar power that's deposited on on the solar array to electricity. And then all of these need backup technologies like either fusion that can create like a base load, and I think that's really pie in the sky and what I would call horizontal energy technology. In the shorter term, grid scale battery storage is super important, and that's why we need to be looking at the same time we're looking at reducing hydrocarbon production. We do need to be looking at critical minerals like lithium, like things like that create these grid scale batteries, because we need to look at supply chains and how those are protected, number one, and how those are exploited. To get to a point where we can wean ourselves off hydrocarbons once and for all.
And is
I'm talking a lot about oil and gas, but I'm not a strong proponent of oil and gas either in the future. So.
And so, and just also kind of a related question: how much gas is there? Are we going to ever run out? In 100 years if we don't come up with these technologies?
Well, we about 10 years ago or 15 years ago came to something that we thought was peak oil, which was a period that the global oil industry thought was basically that was the maximum period of of production, and then we're just going to start having falling returns. But then the fracturing technologies took over, and it's increased the horizontal capacity significantly. I don't know exactly what the future of the next century or 2 centuries is. I think we do have that sort of timeline in mind for what we have, but we shouldn't be burning it all at the end.
In the back, did you have a question?
Yeah, a couple of comments. Ravi Abdullah just did a useful case on the U.S. supplying LNG to Europe. It just came out a couple of weeks ago. Kind of interesting background. Question: where do we get a copy of your slide presentation?
I don't know. I can post. We can.
Yeah, can we distribute? I'm sure we can distribute it. You can email me and I can send it to you. That might be the easiest way.
Yeah, let's just do that.
Okay. Yeah.
One comment: the shorterization is an incredibly efficient investment.
Absolutely.
Really small dollars. You can buy off a lot of people. The best example of that is at Subic Bay when the Philippines voted on getting rid of the U.S. Navy. The Chinese paid off no more than 4 or 5 senators for less than $1 million each. And that's out. So it works the same in Central Europe. Last comment: I spent 12 days in Lithuania after the Russians shut off the gas in midwinter.
In 2009?
No, in 1993, 4. And
Fantastic.
It was
That's right. Oh no, that's right. And yes, and there were stories I recall from colleagues that said that at the time they were using just some of the old, no longer needed Soviet archive papers and burning them for fuel in their offices. So
an hour and a half.
This is terrible.
This is terrible.
Burning archives. Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know. I don't know if
I would go for
that's
trees.
Yeah.
Trees over archives.
Yeah.
Let's hope we avoid that this year.
Yeah.
That would be great.
Yep. I should, on the one more thing on shorterization, there is a guy I forgot to talk about real quick on the very, very edge of this, and this is Putin's re-inauguration a few years ago, and it's telling that in the front row you have Dmitry Medvedev, but you also have Gerhard Schroeder, and you have Lavrov, the foreign minister, several rows back, but in the second row is this guy, very cheerful fellow known as Matthias Wanich, who's a former German, East German Stasi agent, intelligence officer, etc., that is allegedly was friends with Putin in Dresden, or at least in East Germany when Putin was in the KGB, moved to St. Petersburg in the 90s and was friends with Putin then, and has been basically his one of his inside guys ever since. He's the CEO of Nord Stream 2. So again, like, that's the sort of company and project we're talking about here.
So on that very positive and
We
inspiring.
don't want to end on that. No,
No.
come on, someone's got a hopeful question. Is there any hopeful?
We should have stopped at.
Yeah, I like Silan's
Yeah,
question.
exactly.
Let's return to
We
the
need
idea.
horizontal energy technologies for a clean energy future.
Yeah, and there was no oil and gas mentioned in Trump-Zelensky's conversation in July, which probably is a good sign.
No oil, just dirt.
No comment at all. Although I have to say, I do want to say one thing on that, which is nothing specific, but I've seen a lot of this discussion over the past week or so, and if we get to a point where the discussion of Ukraine is partisan, that is a bad thing for transatlantic security. Okay, Ukraine's security is important for all of us, and it doesn't matter what our domestic politics has to say about it. We need to be unified on standing up for that. So I don't know what the future is with this entire story, but I do know that regardless, we can't overlook that in terms of our own national security goals.
Thank you so much to everybody who attended. Thank you so much for your great questions. Let's thank Ben for giving us very informative talk. Next